Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the launch of the IISS Military Balance 2019, the annual assessment of global military capabilities and defense economics from the IISS. Joining me to answer your questions today are Dr. Corey Sharkey, Deputy Director General of the ISS, Professor François Aisbourg, Senior Advisor for Europe at the IISS, Dr. Lucie Béraud-Sudreau, Defense Economist at the IISS, Douglas Barry, Senior Fellow for Air Power at the IISS, and Maya Noland, our Research Fellow for China. The international security environment is now perhaps even more uncertain. Great power competition once again, of course, dominates contemporary Western policy discussions, but today it is not only Moscow that commands attention. China is a concern as it introduces increasingly advanced military systems and pursues developments designed to further improve its own armed forces. China's military modernization is striking both for its ambition and speed of development. Its defense spending has increased relentlessly. In the 10 years to 2017, China's official defense budget grew on average by 8% in real terms. Despite slower economic growth, between 2017 and 2018, the defense budget still grew by nearly 6% in real terms. Chinese naval capability is entering a new phase, designed to facilitate long-distance missions and increase the tempo of operations. Large, high-capability surface combatants are the focus of naval shipbuilding. The simultaneous launch of 2 Type 55 cruisers in June 2018 meant that 4 had been launched in just over a year, and at least 4 more are under construction. By contrast, in terms of ships close to the Type 55 size, in 2018 the United States launched just 1 Arleigh Burke-class destroyer and 1 Zumwalt-class cruiser, while Japan launched the first of 2 Maya-class cruisers. When in service, the Type 55s will likely be formidable anti-air warfare platforms. Currently, the U.S. retains the largest number of advanced anti-air warfare platforms in the world, but China is steadily increasing its number of these vessels. Between 2008 and 2018, Beijing added 13 Type 52C and Type 52D destroyers to its inventory. Meanwhile, China's Air Force continues to improve its capacity for tactical air combat. The Chengdu J-20 heavy fighter is entering frontline squadron service, and we now assess that the PL-15 extended range active radar guided air-to-air missile is also entering service. This is a considerable improvement in the Air Force's military missile inventory and provides China with the ability to contest more effectively the regional air domain. China may have halted for now its land reclamation and island building program in the South China Sea, but it is instead concentrating on building up facilities and weapons on features there. China is developing and indeed already fields weapons that would complicate the plans of armed forces trying to enter the South China Sea, particularly under combat conditions. China's military heft is increasingly felt in the region. However, its military power remains limited, and there are still areas of weakness, such as in training and anti-submarine warfare. In addition, low numbers of enabling systems, like air refueling tankers, ISR platforms, and logistics vessels, currently limit potential expeditionary operations at distance or against a peer adversary. However, China continues to take strides towards addressing these deficiencies. There's attention, too, on the second-order effects of China's military modernization. In the last military balance, we assessed China's exports of armed UAVs. In late 2018, we noted the appearance in Myanmar of China's PL-12 air-to-air missile, which, assuming the system is used effectively, would improve the country's combat air capability. Moving to defense spending. In 2018, global defense spending reached US $1.67 trillion. This was an increase of more than US $80 billion over the previous year and meant that global defense spending rose by nearly 2% between 2017 and 2018 when measured in real terms. China's defense spending continues to rise and contribute to this total. However, the 2018 global increase also reflects higher spending by Western states, notably the U.S. The nominal increase in U.S. spending between 2017 and 2018 at almost US $45 billion comes close to equating to Germany's entire 2018 defense budget. In 2018, this U.S. increase would, if measured by itself, have constituted the 10th largest defense budget in the world. Donald Trump returned to a familiar theme, of course, at the July 2018 NATO summit. The U.S., he said, might do its own thing unless European allies spent more on defense. Although defense spending by NATO's European members grew by 4.2% in 2018, the U.S. will press Europe to spend more. In mid-2018, President Trump said that NATO members should increase defense spending to 2% of GDP immediately. According to our figures, if NATO European states were to have done this in 2018, they would together have had to have found an extra $102 billion on top of their existing budget. They would collectively have had to increase their spending by 38%. By way of comparison, the total that allies would have had to spend to reach 2% in 2014, the year that allies pledged to move towards that target within 10 years, was US $112 billion. So NATO's 70th anniversary celebration will be tempered by awareness that while external actors like Russia may look to undermine Euro-Atlantic cohesion, uncertainty also comes from within. Notably, President Trump's statements have cast doubt on the value that the current U.S. administration places on its alliances. They have unsettled partners who for decades relied on Washington's strategic predictability. But while Germany's Chancellor Merkel, for one, concluded that the U.S. was no longer necessarily a reliable partner, the U.S. remains central to Europe's defense. And notwithstanding President Trump's exhortations about Europe's spending, Washington has continued to devote further funding and equipment to the European continent's defense. Russia remains a focus of Western security concern. This is because of its own military modernization, its occupation of Crimea, its continued and sometimes provocative behavior in the Euro-Atlantic area, and its persistent support for the Syrian regime of President Bashar al-Assad. It is unlikely that Russia will withdraw from Syria or Crimea anytime soon. In Crimea, Russia activated a new airborne unit, modernized a key airbase, and completed replacement of the S-300 air defense system with the S-400. The S-400 will improve Moscow's air defenses in the Black Sea region and complicate the plans of states requiring operational access in times of crisis. Moscow has continued to develop and deploy new nuclear and dual-capable weapons. The avant-garde hypersonic glide vehicle reportedly entered series production in 2018. Meanwhile, Moscow is continuing to deploy the NM-729 SSC-8 Screwdriver ground-launched cruise missile, the missile that led the United States to say Russia was in material breach of the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF, treaty. Another rationale ascribed to the U.S. position is that the INF treaty does not capture either the launcher or missile capabilities of other states, notably China. However, it is difficult to envision a scenario under which China would today enter a regime such as the INF treaty. According to IISS data, there are 501 launchers associated with the PLA Rocket Force's ballistic and cruise missiles. Based on these numbers, complying with INF treaty restrictions would remove 431, or 85%, of these launchers. The remaining 70 are associated with ICBMs and so exempt from the INF. This problem is even more clear-cut when expanding the analysis to China's missiles. In its 2018 assessment of China's military capabilities, The Pentagon assessed the total number of missiles associated with these rocket force launchers as being between 1,500 and 2,000. As such, were China to be included in the current INF treaty, up to 95% of its current ballistic and cruise missile inventory would be prohibited. This would include such systems as the DF-21D so-called carrier killer ballistic missile, and perhaps all of China's short and intermediate range missiles ranged against Taiwan. Advanced military systems and technical knowledge are of course spreading. Some of these systems, such as hypersonic weapons, might hold at risk distant targets previously deemed less vulnerable. Armed forces continue to develop capabilities in other areas such as cyberspace, directed energy, and quantum technologies. China has a national plan to develop artificial intelligence and is accelerating moves to improve civil-military integration to generate defense benefits from developments in the civil sector. Western states are reassessing their assumptions of advantage. For instance, that access to the global commons and freedom to operate in the electromagnetic spectrum are uncontested. The U.S. still retains an edge over potential adversaries, but the gap continues to narrow. The pace of change may mean that advantages in the future, if they exist at all, may be held only fleetingly before the other side catches up. The U.S. and its allies could try to stay ahead and invest accordingly, or they could accept that contestation is normal and in turn adapt their strategies and capabilities. Whatever efforts are pursued, armed forces need to plan on the assumption that their digital networks will be targeted by adversaries and that attempted jamming and more insidiously spoofing may become routine. This may be more evident as adversaries seek to achieve effect by operating below the threshold of war. What I have called tolerance warfare is on the rise. Attacks may happen as much as in what is supposedly peacetime as in war, and as much in a constantly competitive information environment as on the traditional battlefield. As such, societies need to become more resilient, but so too do weapons and networks, enabling troops to fight in a degraded electromagnetic environment. Good training will remain important, as will ensuring that the lessons of recent wars are not lost. So as the military balance enters its 7th decade, our data continues to evolve in response to a shifting defense landscape. We are taking into account new and emerging military capabilities and are employing innovative approaches to how we deliver that data, most notably through our online Military Balance Plus database. Over the last several years, additional categories have made their way into our inventory holdings, such as space systems, uninhabited aerial vehicles, and soon uninhabited maritime vehicles. But we also have to take into account capabilities that are wholly new. Cyber is one, and in 2019, we will produce a methodology for assessing national cyber power. In future, other systems, either not yet conceived or perhaps now with little apparent military use, may also find their way into military inventories. And as they do, we will continue to provide, we trust, the factual basis on which global defense debates can best take place. And with that opening statement, our panel will be happy to take any questions you have on the military balance 2019 or the issues that it raises. Over to you. Yes, please. The microphone will come to you in one moment. And we'll take you in second. And, yep, this one first and then you.
Thank you. Does anyone hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, now it works. Good morning. My name is Thomas Wiegold. I'm writing a blog on defense affairs in Germany, augengradeaus.net. Can you hear me? No.
Yeah, just speak louder.
I can speak louder, of course. Yeah. Won't be a problem at all. You mentioned the number of missiles in China which would come under the provisions of the INF Treaty if it were relevant for China. Given the numbers and the percentage, that gives me the impression that any idea to include China in a similar treaty is just an illusion. Would you concur?
First Corey Sharkey and then Mayor Nolan.
I do think it would be extraordinarily unlikely that the Chinese would agree to give up 95% of the arsenal with which they are determined to intimidate Taiwan and other regional neighbors. I do think it's worthwhile having that conversation with the Chinese because, in particular, getting a hold of those conventional missiles in the Asia-Pacific would help the United States re-engage in a more constructive way on the INF Treaty.
Mayor Nolan and then François Bourg.
Yes, I agree with Corey that it is quite unlikely that China will agree to such provisions. President Xi Jinping's comments at the start of this year towards Taiwan and his goal of reunification before 2049 to achieve the China dream and the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation make any such elimination of an extra tool that they can wield towards pressuring Taiwanese into reunification incredibly unlikely.
Yeah, I would add that President Putin in 2007, when he came to Munich, mentioned the possibility of broadening the INF Treaty to capture other countries, thus including China. My understanding is that there was zero interest from China to that suggestion. I'm not sure that the Russians tried very hard, though, to get the Chinese on board.
Yes, you sir, if you could stand up and the microphone will come to you.
What do you think about yesterday's summit for Iran in Warsaw, and what do you think about the future of Iran nuclear program?
I'd be happy to answer that one. First, the future of the program. For the moment, Iran appears to be in full implementation of the JCPOA, of the nuclear agreement. How strong that commitment will be in the future, we do not know, but for the moment there is no sign that Iran is following America's lead in withdrawing from the treaty. As for the meeting in Warsaw, I was a little bit surprised, I think, as others may have been, by Prime Minister Netanyahu's Twitter message talking about Israel and the Arab countries working together to go to war with Iran. I also note that Twitter message was deleted sometime afterwards during the day, but still it was made. I tend to discount that statement as being part of the pre-electoral noise that you tend to get on this issue in the Israeli debate in such circumstances.
And the gentleman in the black scarf, you could stand up, please. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Hello? Okay. Roland Seneca, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. I was wondering if you could give me a bit of your impression regarding the critics from both sides, from Russia and America. I mean, America has said that Russia is violating the INF Treaty with the SSC-8, and many governments agree, but we do not really have the information in public because it's secret. And on the other side, you got the Russian side, which also says that the United States is violating the treaty with Aegis Ashore because the MK-41, for instance, is a launch system that can be used offensively. So my question is, what is your perspective on the accusations first? And second, in how far could verification missions solve the problem? Thanks.
That's very good. Thank you. First Corey Sharkey, then Doug Barry, and first if you want to add something. Corey.
So a couple of things. The first is that I hope it is not lost on Vice President Pence and Secretary Pompeo and Acting Secretary Shanahan how much a difference it made that America's NATO allies were willing to support a finding that Russia is in material breach of the INF Treaty. That is, that they the deployment of the now 4 battalions of the Russian missiles, it's not a trivial issue, it's not a marginal issue. All 29 NATO countries signed up to that, and that demonstrates the value of standing together in the alliance. The second thing is that your point's a very good one. Restarting the INF verification regimes that I believe were stopped in 2002. Doug, keep me honest if I'm mistaken about that. But giving the opportunity for us to look at whether the Russian missiles are in violation of INF ranges, and giving them the opportunity to see the Aegis Ashore missile defense missiles would be a very stabilizing thing to do.
Doug?
Thanks, John. I mean, to your first point, you're correct. In the public domain, we have not seen as yet a smoking gun. There is, however, a very strong smell of cordite in the air. There's an awful lot of circumstantial evidence around the Russian missile system, which suggests there is actually a treaty breach system. And the way the Russians have, over a long time, dissembled about the nature of the system, and indeed when they did display what they claimed to be the system that the US alleges, again, there was quite a lot of that was really unclear. The allegations vis-à-vis the US, vis-à-vis the Mark 41 launcher and its ability perhaps to take Tomahawk, that's correct, but there are a number of issues around that. They've also raised concerns about the UAVs, which might be in breach again. These are technical issues rather than the US and the NATO allies claim, which is a very serious material breach. In terms of verification, getting back to verification would be really good, but in the current environment, that looks to me to be very hard to do.
François?
First the US, then Russia. The US took a long time to share its intelligence with the outside world on the Russian violations. Those violations were already known under the Obama administration, and the Obama administration, like the early Trump administration, chose not to share that intelligence. That was probably a mistake because, of course, America's information was only revealed quite recently and has been accepted to be correct by all of NATO's members. On Russia, Russia has been unsatisfied with the INF Treaty for at least 12 years. I mentioned President Putin's speech in Munich. That speech was not an endorsement of the INF Treaty. It was the exact opposite. And indeed, it is not entirely by chance, as one sometimes says in Moscow, that violations began several years, only a few years after that statement. But the question does arise, why is Russia doing this? And that poses a broader question of whether the START Treaty will survive or not in 2021. Is INF, the end of INF, the precursor of Russian policy, or is it a one-off? Given the lack of strong defense of the renewal of START, I suspect that this is the beginning of a trend, and it is a trend which is highly destabilizing because Russia's deployments tend to erase the clear distinction which in Russian and /Soviet and American arms control treaties, the clear distinction which was made between what was counted as nuclear and what was counted as conventional. When we look at the Russian deployments of what NATO calls the SSC-8s, we actually don't know whether they should be counted as nuclear or whether they should be counted as conventional. If the START Treaty disappears, that problem will become a general problem, and in terms of crisis management, not having a clear understanding of what is nuclear and what is non-nuclear is a recipe for some very unpleasant moments in the future.
Lisa?
Thank you very much. My name is Ilya Tüchte with the German newspaper Die Rheinpfalz. A question on the overwhelming military advantage that Russia enjoys in the Black Sea area. Given that advantage, would it be sensible to invite Georgia into NATO? U.S. military leaders are arguing in that direction.
So it's a NATO enlargement question. Corey first, then François.
My sense is that the balance of forces in the Black Sea ought not to be the main factor in determining whether Georgia is admitted to NATO. And I think in fairness to Georgia and other aspirant countries, we who are already NATO members need to make sure that we don't create a circumstance whereby they are pulled to apply or pulled into the conversation and then not very quickly made members, because that window of vulnerability for predatory behavior by the Russians, I think, is quite dangerous to those countries. The second thing is, I do think the community of values argument really matters in NATO, and because we are asking all of our countries to sign up that an attack on one of us is an attack on all, I think the political preparation before that needs to be very carefully done. I'm a veteran of the policy development of the Partnership for Peace in the 1990s, and making sure that countries are prepared to not pose threats to their neighbors, to commit to governance. We may have some work to do with existing NATO members, and we probably ought to be quite careful that new members, especially ones that pose the risk of confrontation with Russia over the defense of them, we are quite confident that we're prepared to make that pledge in an ironclad way.
Anything else? Yes, you sir in the second row. If you stand up. Yeah, and then you. Fine.
Thank you. Simon Schuster, Time Magazine. I wanted to ask you to expand a bit. You said there would be some unpleasant moments if we do, in fact, see the end of the START treaty. We've already seen, de facto, the death of the INF. Can you go into some more detail about what exactly that would entail in practical terms, what kind of arms race we would see, or other unpleasant moments? Thank you.
That's a hell of a good question, which I wish I did not need to answer. If you have a crisis, and if you do not know whether the systems which are facing you are nuclear or conventional, this a priori, of course, gives leverage to the country which has created that ambiguity. But it also means, in a crisis situation, that strategic and political planners have to assume the worst case and treat every crisis as having full-blown nuclear potential. That is not a great place to be. Russia has chosen, apparently, to go down the road of erasing the distinction through its violation of the INF Treaty. Let me be very clear here. I'm not particularly exercised by the fact that Russia is adding some dozens of ground-launched cruise missiles to its existing inventory of air-launched and sea-launched cruise missiles. I don't think that this in itself does very much to the overall correlation of forces, to use a Russian expression. But what it does do, by default, is that it doesn't tell us anything about whether these systems are supposed to be nuclear or they're supposed to be conventional. Under the INF Treaty, any INF system is deemed to be nuclear. Nuclear as in the N of INF Treaty. When you leave the treaty, you destroy that assumption. If you apply the same logic to START, if START disappears, the distinctions which exist today and have existed for decades now since the Soviet Union and the United States, whereby you had cruise missiles, air-launched, sea-launched cruise missiles, which were counted as nuclear on the one hand and non-nuclear on the other. It was quite clear and remains quite clear which are which. This is important in terms of crisis management. If the START treaty goes, all of a sudden, nobody will have a clear idea of which is actually which. And this will modify behavior in unpredictable ways in crisis management, and unpredictability is not something you want to increase when you have to deal with crises.
Yes, you, sir.
Nuruddin Freedy from Al Arabian News Channel. I have a question. Are we already entering in an era of ballistic missile race in the world, whether the INF treaty will survive or not? I'm having in mind countries like Israel, others in the Middle East are being equipped with missiles, ballistic missiles, whether Iran, Israel, others, India, Pakistan. Are we already entering an era of a conventional ballistic missile race, maybe at least outside Europe? Thank you.
Doug Barry.
Thank you, John. Ballistic missile racing, well, I mean, keep in mind that the missile technology control regime, while not binding, it's a consensus agreement, has actually been, in terms of ballistic weapons proliferation, pretty successful, actually, I think. And overall, it's been a good regime and it's worked well up to a point on the ballistic side. It's been less successful, actually, on the cruise missile side. And I think that is as much a problem in some ways, rather than actually some kind of breakout on the ballistic side. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay. Anyone else? Yes.
Thank you. Sebastian Sprenger with Defense News. Just a point of clarification. What leads you to believe that the Russians are, in effect, intent on walking away from the START treaty as well?
At this stage, the very low energy level of attempts to renew it. Renewal should, if it happens, has to happen within 2 years. In diplomatic terms, 2 years is a very short period of time. And when you see a very low energy level, both on the Russian side, and I would add on the American side, because this is not only a Russian thing, there is a cybernetic relationship, if I can put it that way. The prospects for renewal of the START treaty are, how to put it, disturbingly low. I hope I'm wrong. Things can still happen within 2 years, but anybody who would extrapolate from the current situation would have to come to that unfortunate conclusion. As I say, it's not only a Russian thing.
Francois is not wrong. Francois is right about this one. And one of the big challenge on the American side, excuse me, the big challenge on the American side is going to be that even though the Trump administration handled the diplomacy of withdrawing from the INF treaty badly, they tried for several years to bring the Russians back into compliance, to incentivize it. The nuclear posture review included the suggestion that if the Russians came back into compliance, the U.S. wouldn't move ahead with either the lower yield nuclear options or additional submarine launch cruise missiles. And so the challenge for those of us who want to sustain strategic stability is, how can we bring the Russians back into compliance with the many treaties they are not in compliance with? Because without that, it'll be very hard to get the energy and excitement towards extending START.
Yes, you, sir, and then Madam next to it. Yep.
My name is Christian Olsen from Danish newspaper Berlingske. I have a question about the 2%. Stoltenberg told NATO defense ministers yesterday that a lot of countries is now entering a phase where they're reaching the 2% within 4 or 5 years. We spoke about that we had already in NATO's piggyback $100 billion extra. What would happen with the power balance between Russia and NATO if everybody reaches the 2% and the military budget goes up in the sky?
Thank you very much. Let's first have our excellent defense economist, Dr. Lucie Béraud-Coudreau.
Thank you, John. Thank you for this question. So to address the issue of the power balance between Russia and NATO Europe, actually, if you take NATO European states altogether, they already spend much more than Russia. So altogether, they spend 264 billion, while Russia, when looking at exchange rates, spends 63 billion. So the difference is already there.
François?
Let me put it this way. If defense were only about money, we wouldn't actually be having a NATO problem for the reason which has just been stated. Defense, first of all, is not only about money. You can spend it wisely, you can spend it efficiently, and clearly the Russians are getting a lot of bang out of their defense ruble, which some of NATO's members are not getting out of their money. Just to remind you, Russia's military expenditure is not much larger than Britain's military expenditure, which is another way of saying maybe the Russians are doing something smarter than we are. The second issue, the more important one, is that if you're European and if you start getting worried about America turning its back on NATO, and that is a worry which is clearly animating a number of politicians and analysts in Europe today, and not only where you would normally expect them, like in Gaullist France, well, then Europe has to spend substantially more. Not because Mr. Trump wants us to spend more, but because we are going to have to spend more because Mr. Trump is making our life difficult by removing his country from its previous commitments to NATO. In the darkest scenario, this has not happened, but it is a worry. So the 2% issue plays differently depending on what you're talking about. When the French went on the 2% pledge, and which was confirmed by President Macron, the objective was not to please the Americans in general or Mr. Trump in particular. The objective was, how do we live in a world in which the Americans may not be as present as they used to be? This was a very French thing for some time. This is now becoming a much more European concern.
Lucie, you want to add something?
I just want to throw in another statistic to corroborate François' point about efficiency of spending. So the NATO threshold for procurement spending is 20%. The Russians are spending 40% of their budget on procurement and modernization.
Thank you very much. The lady there, please.
I'm Keiko. Hello.
Yes.
I'm Keiko Izuka from a Japanese newspaper Yomiuri Shimbun. And what is your assessment on North Korea's missile and the nuclear development in the wake of Trump and Kim Jong-un dialogue since last year?
Doug, do you want to address that, and maybe then Corey on the more general issue?
In terms of the missiles themselves specifically, development seems to have slowed. Obviously, much less testing, but I think the idea that the DPRK, having spent so much of I mean, a huge amount of investment in relative terms in what it sees as a strategic backstop is going to give them completely up, strikes me as very unlikely.
Thanks very much.
I agree with everything Doug just said. I think the challenge, especially as the second Trump-Kim summit approaches, is that the President of the United States has repeatedly made statements that suggest there has been progress towards denuclearization and suggest that the North Korean government is committed to complete and verifiable denuclearization. And the expert community believes that the president doesn't actually understand what the North Koreans are saying, and that what the North Koreans are saying is that they will give up their nuclear program when the United States gives up the United States' nuclear program. And so that creates an enormous amount of unpredictability around the summit, and President Trump looking for a way to salvage his credibility on this. I think you could see a lot of asymmetric possibilities. President Trump agreeing to draw down U.S. forces on the Korean Peninsula, for example, or other things that would be destabilizing and would create friction with America's close allies like Japan and South Korea.
Thank you. Yes.
We've been talking a lot about the INF Treaty, maybe a bit about China. I would like to add another question, and this goes to Maya. If I take a look at the figures, I see that the US is by far the biggest investor on earth with defense expenditure, but the salaries are completely different. So my question to you would be, Maya, in how far can you really compare the expenditures of China and the US? I could also add Russia. How powerful are the defense expenditures for the governments? How much can they do with it? Thanks.
Just before Maya answers, I should say that we do have a IISS research project in preparation looking at a methodology to assess Chinese defense expenditure, because there are many different types of estimates around there. There's our estimate, there's a Pentagon estimate, there are other places that also make their own estimates, and we think the time is now ripe to develop a robust methodology for understanding all the expenditure that China makes that can be properly attributed to defense as it's normally defined. But with that preface, Maya?
Yes, thank you, John. And we look forward to conducting that research. It's a really great question. So in terms of the official figures that China actually releases for its defense budget, we estimate that probably a third of that budget, of that figure, should be added on top of that for things like defense innovation and procurement, which are probably not counted in the figure that they release. Now, salaries are lower in China than in the United States, so they are most likely able to get a bigger bang, or if we use the US dollar, for their buck. On top of that, of course, procurement is different in China than it is in the West. So the use of state-owned enterprises, which are becoming increasingly competitive, and maybe Lucy wants to talk a little bit about that, because we've done some research together on the competitiveness of China's top defense SOEs within the top 100 ranking of the world. All that together paints a rather more, I guess, efficient picture from the Chinese perspective, having this top-down, whole-of-government approach to defense innovation and procurement.
Lucy?
Thank you. Well, I think Maya covered it all, but just to throw in yet another number in there is kind of my job. So the official budget for China is 168 US billion, and we produce another estimate, which you will find in the book, that kind of includes those extra categories of budget that Maya mentioned. And for this, we put the number at over 200 billion US dollars for China. So they're bigger than the official budget, but still lower than the US.
François, then Corey?
Yeah, I would also add that China is still running behind in enabling and support functions, in-flight refueling, logistic vessels, and so on. And these are quite expensive. China has tended to focus on the sharp end, on the hard end of its defense capabilities, which makes sense. But that gives the impression of a force which is being created, which is maybe not quite as, how to put it, deeply rooted as it will be in 10 or 20 years. They still have a way to go before they have a broad spectrum, globally capable force able to operate for a long time far away from home.
I liked your point about the asymmetry. That is, the U.S. is a global military power and China is still predominantly a regional military power. Dr. Buro Sudro has done some outstanding work looking at what proportion of the American defense budget is actually specifically allocated to its European responsibilities. And I encourage you to ask her about it because it's fantastic work.
You just did.
But the other thing is that the U.S. ability to flow forces between theaters is additional to what is specific to the theaters. And so Russia thinks of itself as a global operator and has proved it in Syria. The Chinese begin to undertake operations in other places, in particular where they have economic interests and are looking to expand that. But your question does go to the fundamental asymmetry of the U.S. as a global power.
Maya? No?
Yes, just on the point about China being a regional power versus a global power and when that will happen, China has two goals for its military modernization. The first one is for 2035 to have a modernized force. For 2049, China aims, according to Xi Jinping's plans, to be a global, a military with global power projection capabilities and the ability to fight and win wars. So really for 2035, we're looking at a regional capability that it's working towards in 2049 for that more global mission and presence.
Thank you very much. Oh, Lucy, was there something left hanging? All right. If the Deputy Director General asks you a question, you should answer.
Yes, boss. Yes, so Corey's question was about how much the US actually commit directly to European defense. So there'll be a blog on our website soon, but the basic statistics is to say that out of the $643 billion that the US spend on defense, about only $35 billion are directly linked to European security, and that represents around 5.6% of the US total budget. But all the details will be on the website quite soon.
And someone in the back row, yes please.
Thank you very much. My name is Kobalik Likadze. I'm from RFRL, Georgian service. My country is partly occupied from Russian, and for Georgian citizens, Russia is endless source of threat, and you probably agreed with me. I covered all conflicts in Georgia, and I know what is Russia when he is moving with its forces to get his mission to its neighborhood countries. But why, for Georgia, it is not clear why for NATO and European country, Russia is source of so-called endless threat when gross budget of NATO is 100 times more than Russia, and it was just all time remembered here. Maybe not Russia is strong, but NATO and the European country are divided, and this division is stronger and stronger. How to deal with Russia? What we can do to stop further aggression of Russian Federation? Thank you very much.
Thank you. François?
I would simply add to what you said, because I think you have in a way summarized the situation. Russia is next door. Russia is united in its purpose, and the same situation does not prevail. But military geography is also of overriding importance. Russia is next door in the most basic sense of the word. NATO is far away. You have to cross water, you have to cross territory. Even if there were unity of purpose, it would actually be quite difficult. When we cope with the defense of the Baltic states, members of NATO, it is militarily and strategically quite challenging. We do what is necessary, but it is not actually that easy, notwithstanding the discrepancy between Russia's expenditures and NATO's expenditures. When you have the border of Estonia, which is 100 kilometers away from St. Petersburg, the military geography plays a very, very heavy role.
Thank you very much. And one more, yes please.
Thank you. Daniel Bohmer of Die Welt newspaper in Germany. I wonder, around the time of the signing of the JCPOA, there was a great concern that new countries were pondering the possibility of developing nuclear capabilities. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, even Brazil. How relevant is this concern to you today?
Corey?
I'll say a word, yeah.
I think it was and is a major concern. What has forestalled it being even more anxiety-producing is that Iran has continued to comply by the terms of the JCPOA, even though the United States withdrew from it. And so what many of us feared, which was the U.S. withdrawal would start a cascade, because the Iranians would restart their nuclear weapons programs, and that would precipitate responses from Saudi Arabia, from Turkey, from Egypt, from other regional countries. And so the work of the European countries in trying to incentivize Iran to remain in compliance is actually the main reason we have not yet seen that cascade. So Europeans actually deserve a lot of credit for that. And it's a pity the vice president of my country didn't give them more credit for that in Warsaw yesterday.
Yeah, I would simply add to Corey's words that China and Russia are signatories of the JCPOA as well. They have no basic interest in seeing Iran move out of the JCPOA, and they have to be proactive in working also towards the defense of the JCPOA. The Europeans have actually been doing the heavy lifting. As a European, I find this absolutely normal. I find it admirable in the way that Corey was putting it, but it's going to take a lot of work by all countries concerned, and that includes the other permanent members of the Security Council, China and Russia.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Let me thank two other bodies. First, the Munich Security Conference for giving us this opportunity, and Susanna Zickert in particular for facilitating our presence here. Second, to thank the Defense and Military Analysis Program of the IISS, some of whose members are arrayed here, some of whose members are in the front row, and others are working very hard back in London to produce this extraordinary book of facts and data on which intelligent defense assessments can be made. So thank you to all of you, and we look forward to having this conversation again in the future. Thank you.